Hello, and welcome to Medieval Lulls, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Mary Wellesley.
And I'm Irina Dumitrescu.
And we're both writers, literary historians, and contributors to the paper. In this series, we're asking, was the Middle Ages funny? And to answer that today, we're looking at a comic dialogue in verse about a very clever old woman and her unfortunate dog. We are, of course, talking about Dame Syrith. Okay, Irina, so let's start with what kind of a text is Dame Syrith?
Well, we've met stories like it before. This is a fabliaux, which, as we remember from our last episode, is a short comic tale in verse. And, as we know, these are very popular in Old French. There are lots and lots of them from the 13th century. And we also know that Chaucer drew on the tradition. So the Miller's Tale, which we dealt with in another episode, is also a fabliaux. They're very well crafted and structured and very tightly plotted. We also, our listeners will remember this is the kind of story that tends to involve rustic or lower class people, though not necessarily, but that's quite typical, and somewhat coarse themes. There's sex, there's trickery around sex, there's some kind of cleverness. So this is sort of where we are. Dame Syrith is one of the few English fabliaux at all, and certainly one of the few that's not by Chaucer.
Yeah, and right at the beginning, we hear the narrator say, "This is a story I heard on the journey." Mm-hmm. So we're kind of immediately in this world of oral performance, and this kind of sense of the sort of the looseness and spontaneity of a colloquial anecdote, right?
Absolutely. And what's interesting about this poem is it also has a ton of dialogue. It really has the feeling of something that's meant to be performed, whether by one person doing different voices or a group. It moves very fast. The verse is not particularly poetic or anything like that. It's not high poetry or high art. It's a kind of fast moving story that's going to get to a bit of a punchline at the end.
Yeah, we should also contextualize with kind of date and milieu. So it's from the last quarter of the 13th century. It's anonymous. The scribal dialect suggests that it's from somewhere like Worcestershire or Gloucestershire. And the first kind of provenance information, so the first known owners were from that kind of area of England. So that kind of makes sense. And it's from this manuscript, which is a real kind of ragbag of lots of different texts. The thing I've definitely said on previous episodes is that a medieval manuscript is much more like a modern bookshelf, right? It's a whole series of texts put together, often without a kind of clear anthologizing structure to them. And this one is a perfect example. There's 101 texts in French, in Latin, and this kind of quite early form of Middle English. And it looks from the manuscript like it was originally in kind of booklets and then it was sewn together. And it seems to have been made for a lay reader. But what's also interesting is that many of the texts that appear within the manuscript also appear elsewhere, which is it's a relatively rare thing. It's not unheard of, but it's a relatively rare thing in Middle English manuscripts to find such a high concentration of texts that appear elsewhere. And it's a very good indication that these were really popular stories. So what we're dealing with here is something that is clearly made for a lay reader, right? But somebody with a level of education, because we know that there's Latin and there's also French. This is a trilingual manuscript, and that's also another thing to think about. This kind of trilingual culture in England in the 13th century, where you've got the different languages working together in this kind of wonderful sort of cocktail, and these different literary traditions. So, as you said, the fabliaux is generally a form we kind of associate with French texts. So it sort of makes sense that in this kind of Fronglish, perhaps you might say, manuscript, we find this story in Middle English, which is nonetheless very much characteristic of kind of French literary forms. So we've got this text, which is clearly borrowing elements of French literature. It's a kind of French literary form, but it's English, but it's in this kind of mixed manuscript context, clearly for an educated reader. But what actually happens in it?
Well, it's a story of lust, and it's a story of trickery, which we'll get to in a moment. So basically, we're introduced first to the clerk Wilkin. I mean, how would you pronounce his name, Mary?
Well, that's interesting because I spent quite a bit of time yesterday considering whether it should be pronounced Willikin and whether we should see that as early slang for a penis. But it seems that is not that slang doesn't appear until the 19th century, so it's not that.
That's very unfortunate. Yeah.
Very unfortunate for our purposes. But maybe the kind of name is meant to play on on more like the word wily, and we're meant to see him as this kind of wily figure. But then kin is this diminutive form, right? So he's like the little wily one,
like Wilkin.
Yeah, like Wilkin.
Wilkin.
I suppose you'd probably say it Wilkin, I would think.
So this educated young man, is absolutely in love with a married woman named Marjorie, also kind of a very standard name in medieval England. We think of Marjorie Kemp, for example. And she is middle class. She's married to a merchant and quite happily married to him. And he tries to seduce her when her husband is away on business. And she is very polite to him. She welcomes him in her home, suspecting nothing. But when he makes his move, she makes it very clear that she has no interest in him, and also that she loves her husband. And I think that's quite interesting because very often in these poems of seduction or rape or trickery, however we want to talk about them, and we'll cover the whole variety. There's often the sense, well, maybe force or trickery has to be used to get a woman to do what she actually wants to do sexually, but wouldn't allow herself to because of propriety. But I don't think that's the case with Marjorie. She seems to just love her husband and be quite happy with him and have no interest in this young man. He strikes out and he meets an old woman named Dame Syrith. And Dame Syrith is a wise woman. He's advised by a friend to go to her for help. I mean, I think there's a sense of older women having experience in matters like this, and this is something we'll talk about at greater length later. There's also the implication that she might know witchcraft, right? No evidence in the story that she does, but again, this is one of the assumptions about older women. Who's going to know a few magic tricks? Well, it's probably an old woman.
She refutes that accusation later.
She does.
Yeah,
she does. She doesn't know witchcraft. She just knows how to be tricky. And she says she doesn't know any witchcraft, but the implication is that she would, right? So he basically pays her to help him get together with Marjorie. And she comes up with a trick.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the trick, Mary?
I love the trick. Yeah, I'd love to talk about the trick.
Because it involves unfair behavior towards a pet dog.
Yes, exactly. Harmful content warning towards pet owners. So Dame Syrith has a dog and she says, don't worry, I'm going to sort this out. But then an interesting detail before she says that, she says, I don't want anyone in the community to know. Which is I think that's quite interesting. We have this idea of this small community where everyone knows what everyone else does. And the sort of sense of shame and opprobrium that attaches to, which is kind of funny in a way because so much of texts of this kind suggest that people were happily having sex with each other outside marriage. But she seems to be, in a way, she's sort of, it's not quite a moral compass because she's not worried about that, but she's sort of sounding a note of caution, which is perhaps not what you might expect. So she has a dog and she feeds the poor dog mustard and pepper and then says to the clerk, don't worry, I've got this under control. So then she sets off to Marjorie's home and by this point, the poor dog is weeping because it's been fed mustard and pepper. And she turns up at Marjorie's house and she says, oh, and she's kind of, badly dressed and she looks very poor. And Marjorie is obviously, a very kind of upstanding, member of the community. And she sees this old woman who is bewailing her fate. And so she welcomes her in and offers her food. And Dame Syrith says, I'm so sad. I had a beautiful daughter. She was the the light of my life, and a scholar fell in love with her, and she refused his advances, and so he turned her into this dog, and that's why she's weeping, because she used to be my daughter, and now she's a dog. And Marjorie looks at the weeping dog and is then very concerned that she will herself be turned into a dog by the clerk. And so then she immediately sends for the clerk, and that's the end of the story.